Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we're going to be talking about none other than the workhouses, and we are very lucky because Warren Jew has just returned. I have now finally seen his face. I was thinking about seeing his face, but then unfortunately his face has gone black until now where I can actually see him. So you're very lucky to be able to see Warren Jew's face today. So essentially, we're going to be talking about a few things, as in the title in this stream. We're going to be talking about the dialectics of sin. What is sin, how it works, and of course, when you talk about sin, you have to talk about redemption, and we're going to be talking about that as well. And finally, we're going to be talking about God, the nature of God. Warren Jew has been reading a bit about it recently, so I'm quite curious to see what he thinks about it now. So, Warren Jew, how are you? You've completely frozen, and I honestly don't know whether it's my Wi-Fi or your Wi-Fi or the entire thing's wrong anymore.
No, I'm good. Shall we start? So what where
Indeed.
do you want to start?
Perhaps we could start off with the nature of sin, perhaps. Like, what is sin to you? Or perhaps more interestingly, perhaps we're touching off or building upon what we discussed in our last video when we talked about Don Quixote together. We were talking about the good in it and the evil in it, that the Dostoevskian type of sin. And perhaps that's a good place to start off with. Where exactly do we get sin from? How do we find it? And actually, what role does it play in our lives and our development?
I would argue that just as last time, I argue that evil is constitutive of the good. I would also say that sin is almost the necessary byproduct of a hope, or it's the outcome of human potentialities. So what I think is sin is our constant failure to fulfill our potential. So let's say I have a lot of outcomes that I can pursue, or a lot of options that I can pursue by virtue of being human. I can choose between different paths. And sin is when I don't choose the path that is the best for me, given the information I have right now, because of my human weakness. And I think this failure to actualize potential is sin.
I think what you touch upon is very interesting because it's definitely something which is quite, I would like to say, quite a Christian, or at least has certain Christian and even Greek and Hindu marks. Because of course, in these languages or in these religions, of course, sin is the idea of missing the mark, not reaching a certain standard of what you're meant to work to. And a lot of times, unlike viewing them as just strict laws, it's also a very individualistic thing in that if you are not working to your best, if you're not making the most of your opportunity, that is in itself sin. And I think that that's something that we touch upon, or you touch upon quite well, and it's something that we discussed quite well in the last discussion.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what Jaspers called the metaphysical guilt. He had this sort of division of guilt into a few of them. It's like a personal guilt, and then you have political guilt, you have some other guilt, and then you have this metaphysical guilt. And the other guilt are things that you've done or things other people have done in the world, which makes you guilty. But this metaphysical guilt for Jaspers is this guilt that one has by virtue of being human. And I think this is the guilt that one has by virtue of being the being who can take a stand on its own being, the Heidegger's definition of Dasein. And it is this that makes us guilty from the beginning, because of all the potentials that we have, it's almost impossible for us to actualize all of them.
And do you think perhaps that this metaphysical guilt is something tied into the fact that we fail? And how would you perhaps tie this idea into the idea of the sinless or the guiltless being realized in Christ or something like that? What would necessarily be that role? Is that metaphysical guilt shared with them as well, or is it kind of something else? How would you interact or relate these two ideas?
Perhaps Christ is the antidote to sin. At least that's how I understand the Christian narrative. You have Christ, which saves us from the devastating consequences of our sin, and how we are to join Christ is to bear the burden of the cross and to imitate him. And for me, I think it's almost this very act of imitating the good is the process by which we can actualize the most potential. And it is this that makes bearing the cross a worthy pursuit. Although, of course, the billion-dollar question is, what exactly is this ultimate mode of being? this ultimately good mode of being manifested, embodied in Christ, which is the one that is devoid of sin. And what do you think? What do you think is that way of being?
Well, perhaps the best way to understand that mode of being is perhaps to understand its inverse, because of course in a Chinese kind of culture, there's always this conception of the yin and the yang, the black in the white and the white within the black, and the idea that the black within the white, although small, has boundless potential and impact in the white, despite them being very different. And of course, it's very weird for me looking at Warren Ju here, because he looks like an absolute, like, his face is just completely like distorted in the quality of the footage, but it does not really matter too much, I suppose. But there's this idea that understanding sin is first to understand the not sin, and perhaps in the same way to understand what it means to not sin is to understand sin itself. And perhaps what and of course I was reading a bit about Dostoevsky, an analysis by Kasana Blank recently, where she goes on and writes, perhaps it is precisely not necessarily that sin is good, but rather that sin brings people so close to a sense of death that it is precisely that act of the only way you need, or the only way you can get out of that death that you've put yourself in through sin, is via redemption. So it's precisely the horridness of sin which realizes the resurrection.
And it seems to be a motif of someone who's almost extremely fallen and very morally deprived, who somehow attains moral perfection through by the very act of being deprived and realizing something within inside the depths of hell. And well, then what do you think, Dostoevsky? Well, I guess there's two problems here. One problem is if you say that we can only understand sin by understanding what is not sin, and understand what is not sin by what is sin, then what is the exact entry point that we can start with in order to understand both phenomenon? And second, then I guess the related question is, what exactly do you think Dostoevsky think is sin?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that your idea of you can only understand sin via non-sin and only non-sin via sin is the idea that the mark. For example, you can only understand a target via what you're trying to hit. If you're having an archery, you wouldn't know what is the target if you don't know what it means to miss on the other side of it. But at the same time, you wouldn't be able to understand what it means to miss if you don't have a target, because to miss is to know that there's a target, but to target is to know that there's a part which is not the target. And perhaps the way to know it is that the first way to do it is to understand the situation of being in the archery range, or perhaps in the idea of sin and perfection or moral bliss, is perhaps to say is that to understand it is to enter the world and to live in the world. To be human is to understand the concepts of sin and that of good, and that's perhaps the most initial, or the starting place where you can enter the discussion or have a thought about it.
Okay, so the way that we can understand sin is to first we can understand sin because we are already within the cycle of sinning and non-sinning. I take that as what you mean. And I guess a related question with this, because this reminds me of the Kierkegaardian notion of despair. And for Kierkegaard, I think despair is also the inability for me to achieve my potential. But do you think there's a link between despair and sin? And especially in the Kierkegaardian notion of despair, there's the idea that the ultimate despair is when you don't know that you're in despair. Do you think maybe there is a sin in not realizing that one is sinning, and somehow one would be better off if one realizes that one is sinning, or one identifies one's evil, even if one does not immediately change it after the identification?
Mm-hmm. I think you're touching on a very interesting point, and there's this idea of the conscious nature of sin, and perhaps one of the ways is the unveiling idea in sin in Christianity, where it says, well, Christ, help me with my unbelief. It's the idea that sin is in front of you, but you're not necessarily reaching out to, or you are unable to believe the sin which is in front of you. For example, when you look at someone who perhaps is fallen, or someone doesn't know the problem, or the best way to illustrate this might be the person who claims about the lack of success when they also are simultaneously not working hard, when they're wasting their lives away, either drinking or stuff like that. it's that precise, that dialectic, what you're wrestling here is precisely what we're talking about, the understanding of sin and the not sin, is the fact that the sin and the knowledge of it is right in front of you. You're just unwilling perhaps to look at it and confront it because it's scary. It's the idea, the Nietzschean idea of you look into the abyss and the abyss stares right back at you. It's the idea of you're staring into the abyss, but you don't want to even go there because it's too close to you, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe even it's that you have a sense of the abyss in front of you, but you don't want to look at it. So you distract yourself left and right in order to not look straight at the abyss. In this very act of distracting oneself away from the abyss is makes the abyss all the more, I don't know, all devouring. Because I have to, because recently, as I've told you, I've been quite addicted to what Chinese Wattpad fiction, and what I find a phenomenon is that once I'm maybe 20 minutes in of reading it, I'm like, because I plan to read it for like 10 minutes, and I'm 20 minutes in, I'm like, okay, I don't really want to stop, because when I stop, I have to confront the fact that I have went over the time limit that I've set myself to read this thing, and then at the end, I'm like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm still reading this Wattpad fiction because I'm just not unwilling to confront it. And this very act of unwilling to confront the abyss is also a mechanism by which we fall further down into sin. Would you agree?
I agree, and I think perhaps you could even make another formulation, which is perhaps even stronger, to say that it is precisely the turning away from it which makes the abyss even worse, or in some sense makes abyss what it is. For example, Godot in Waiting for Godot, the play by Samuel Beckett, is precisely that Godot never arrives, which makes Godot Godot. If Godot arrives, Godot is no longer Godot, perhaps. And in the same way, some sense, the abyss is the abyss because you precisely don't look down into it. And if you look down into it, you realize it's not much of an abyss, but perhaps something you can indeed overcome.
So the crucial choice here is the very act of confronting, or the mustering of courage to confront in almost a Tillichian sense. That is the antidote to sin. Would this be the formula?
I think that is the first step to it, in the sense that you must first take a leap towards the sin to understand what it is before you can overcome it, and that is perhaps the starting point of all discussion. Now, to those in the comment sections, or right now, I would like to suggest, or I would like to let you know that if you have any questions about what we're discussing right now, I would answer them. But of course, anything which goes on a tangent, I'll try not to, just because I think the plan for these live streams now is to make them a bit more analyzed and structured, just that we kind of develop the discussion further and just be a bit more precise. Now, of course, Jeremy G asks, why is sin relevant anyway? Do you have any thoughts about that, Warren Ju?
Well, I think it's relevant in the same way that Josh said we understand sin by virtue of being human. I think sin is relevant to us. Of course, it's a very old word, and people almost recoil against this word because there's all these religious Christian baggage. But I think just the baggage is important, but even taking it as a psychological concept is just extremely important, because I'm sure that we have all felt the sense of, I guess, failure, the sense of despair, the sense that I have not done what I should do. And I think it is at those moments where my conscience calls out to me saying, you have missed the mark, you have failed, that sin is imposed on us. Although the nature of sin, the reality of sin is imposed on us. And what we wish to do when we're trying to understand sin is to understand why we always fail and miss the mark, and what we can do to make its occurrence less frequent. And I think it would be a much better world and a much better life if we were to sin much less. I think that would be my answer. What would be yours, Josh?
Well, I think that a good way to look at this is to perhaps look at the reflection of it as well, to just say that sin can be best viewed via, of course, what we looked at about the kind of the destructive nature of it, but also the fact that it does indeed have a way out, in the sense that when you do indeed confront sin and you overcome it, you lead to a moral development and moral growth, which I think is a good thing, almost by definition is a good thing. And as a result, sin is relevant precisely because it is a way in which it leads to moral growth. And that's like what we see in most great storylines, the motif of always the fallen hero becoming, or at least finding some sense of redemption at the end. It's the idea of, in order to find the redemption, you must first look at the flaws and recognize the flaws. And that perhaps is the dual aspect of sin. Yes, sin is very bad in itself, but at the same time, it is able to, you're able to overcome it via facing it if you so want to. And that can unleash perhaps the potential of the sin that we experience. Now, just to clarify this discussion, yes, I am Christian, Warren is an agnostic, and that's just kind of how, if that kind of helps the discussion further, or your question.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I guess to be honest, I don't really know what I am. I'm just playing around with ideas mostly. I think I am in sin by only playing around with ideas and not committing to any of them. But that might be another discussion.
Indeed.
I think what I feel like is it's almost inadequate for one to say that you can overcome sin by merely by wanting to confront sin. Because for me, it's almost the act of wanting is not strong enough for me to confront it. As in, there's this phenomenon of weakness of will, and there are things that I want to do that I do not do. For example, I probably want to, let's say, I want to get exercise every day, but a lot of days I don't do so. I want to sleep early every day, but a lot of times I don't. So this wanting, I think it's insufficient as an antidote to the confrontation of sin. Do you have any other clarifications on this idea of wanting?
Well, I think that wanting is not to say the eradication or the ending of sin. It's rather, it is the first step that we all must take. For example, in order to figure out where the leakage is, you must first try to look for it. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to solve the leakage. It just means at least you know where to start and where to work around and where to fix it. Because if you don't know where the problem is, then you'll never find it. But a lot of times we just try ourselves not to be able to be not strong enough to overcome it. Is precisely that gap that we're trying to look at. And I think what you are discussing or touching upon is and I think it is indeed a procedural thing. So you first have to want to do it, and then you can struggle with it more, and then you can overcome it. Now, of course, the idea you can do nothing to eradicate sin, that perhaps is the secondary question. And the answer is yes and no. I think you cannot eradicate sin because we are fallible. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we cannot improve. And I think that those are indeed two different concepts. And that's something we need to clarify and understand when we're talking about. When I say we're overcoming sin, is not to say that we become morally perfect. What I am trying to say, however, is that we become better. And you don't need to become perfect to be able to become better. I think that is a very clear discussion. And perhaps that even the first step towards becoming better is sufficient and significant in itself already, such that the expectation we have to eradicate sin is not a correct expectation at all, but rather just that we embrace on the journey of becoming better.
Mm-hmm. And even maybe it's maybe not so good that we don't have any sin, as in it is the reality of sin that enables us to see something better, in the same way that it is by the eating of the apple from Adam and Eve that human beings had consciousness and is able to see the world. So I think there's almost a double nature to sin. Even though it's horrible, it's also a manifestation of human beings' likeness to God, almost, but the insufficient likeness to God.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this perhaps is where you might I think is a bit wrong. I agree with you that sin has indeed two natures. But at the same time, I think that the metaphor you use might be wrong, because I wouldn't say sin is good because it is good in itself, but rather it opens up potential towards the good. And I think that is the difference, in the sense that the ability to sin is good. The act of sin isn't good, but at the same time, it is through the act of sin that you can further reflect on the good. And that is exactly what we mean by knowing you missed the mark is how you understand the mark. It's like when you're playing golf and your the ball keeps on flying the other side. It's the fact that it's flying away that you know that you're not going straight, and you have to identify a problem. And that's kind of a relationship that we're discovering, or I think we're working towards.
I think we're almost touching on a very hot moral debate of the idea that World War II and the Holocaust is good because it provided opportunities for people to do good things in a very dangerous and a very morally appalling situation. How would you respond to that? In the sense that by putting people in concentration camps, such as in the Holocaust, we've in fact done a great service to the world, because in those concentration camps, the goodness of human beings can manifest all the more strongly through ordinary acts of kindness.
I think the answer is this: is that the ability to put someone in the Holocaust is good. The act of the Holocaust is not good, but rather it does indeed allow for great repentance, in the same sense that it would be absurd, and this is what Nikolai Berdyaev says, is that it is absurd and immature to say that sin is in itself good. That is immature, and to pursue sin just because it is good is going to just go against yourself, and that is the most evil thing you can think. However, one must not recognize, or one must not acknowledge the reality that sin is precisely good because it is so evil, in the sense that sin has the ability to lead to good precisely because it's so evil. And this is precisely what Berdyaev is talking about, is precisely when he says, well, and Dostoevsky to some extent is to say, well, sin brings you so close to death that its only way out is redemption. And it is precisely the depth of that pit which leads to the tallest mountain. For example, if you fall into a well, falling into a well isn't good, but it's by falling into the well that you get lifted the highest up back towards it. The deeper the well, the higher you have to get pulled up to be saved. In the same way, there is that similar dynamic with sin as well.
So would you say this is a solution to the problem of evil? That's God is doing a good through evil?
Well, no, I think that, and it depends what you mean by the problem of evil. I mean, if it's the existence of evil, I don't necessarily think that is the case, and I don't think that the evil in the world is necessarily. It really depends on what you mean by evil. For example, natural suffering, I wouldn't necessarily say that's evil. The fact that there's a tsunami, I wouldn't necessarily classify that as evil. I think that's perhaps a misjustification of the terms. Perhaps it's suffering, but it's definitely not evil.
So, I think that's interesting. Where do we go from suffering to evil? Because of course there's the Buddhist wisdom, right? That or what I call the almost enlightened Western Buddhist wisdom, where it's fine if there's all those suffering. It's only how you look at the suffering. And if you look at the suffering in a good way, the suffering is good. If you look at the suffering in a bad way, the suffering is evil. Would you agree with this characterization?
Well, I think that the characterization here might be a bit inaccurate in the sense that when we are discussing, for example, and this would perhaps answer Jeremy G's question, is precisely the idea, the difference between what you consider evil and what you consider suffering, because lots of things can cause suffering, but there's no moral agent to label the act as evil. For example, you can call Hitler evil because he had a will and he acted upon that will, and that classified as morally evil. You wouldn't necessarily call a tree branch falling off the tree evil because the tree doesn't necessarily have a will to cut off its own tree branch and lead the tree branch to fall down. And in the same sense, there is indeed a difference between what we call evil attributed to free moral agents and suffering, which is caused by natural beings. So it's not necessarily a problem of evil, it is a problem of suffering. That's of a different category, I would say. And perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on the question that you were asking as well, because I think my response only answers a certain stem of, but not the whole one.
Yeah, I think I would respond to your idea that tsunami is not evil by proposing the following scenario. Let's say perhaps the occurrence of the tsunami is not evil, but it seems to me that the causing of the suffering that the tsunami did is to a large extent evil, because there is the possibility.
My friend, do you have anything else to say? You've gone completely silent, my friend. You've gone completely silent. But perhaps, I don't know what has happened. My friend has gone completely silent. Not only does this thing lag, alas, can you hear us in the chat? Like, can you hear it? Can you hear us? Can you at least hear me? Because Warren, I heard Warren just now, but he's gone completely silent. like in the chat, Jeremy G, can you hear me? But I personally think that I think there's something wrong with your earphones.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
I think it's my headphones problem. My headphone just turned weird.
I think they've turned off. Yes, indeed. Hopefully it's better now. So essentially, the idea I think here is precisely that. Can you continue your discussion because you cut off in the middle of your dialogue? So I mean, can you continue your discussion?
Okay, so I think I went to you have the occurrence of tsunami, which is indifferent, but the suffering that the tsunami causes, I think, is partially evil in the sense that it is relating to our discussion of sin, the failure of human beings to actualize certain potentials or certain pathways open to them. For example, there's the Hurricane Katrina, and in fact, if at least American people thought long-term plan a bit better, I've seen estimates, and planned for the occurrence of a tsunami, then there wouldn't have been so much damage to facilities, and much suffering will be relieved. And even in a case such as a famine, let's say there's a natural disaster and there's less rainfall than expected in a single year, and it led to maybe 2 million dying of famine. What that was not only pure suffering caused by this natural event, but also the human failure to prepare for the future, either on an individual level or on a collective level. And I think this suffering is evil. So could even say that it's an evil prompted by the occurrence of a natural disaster. So somehow you have sin at the one end, and sin creates the possibility for evil, and it is activated by a natural disaster, such as a tsunami or a bad harvest. And it's the collapse of the two that leads to sin. That leads to evil.
Well, I think the main problem with that line of thought is that it doesn't change the problem, or it actually just agrees with what I'm saying, because essentially what you're arguing for is that the people's reaction is evil. The natural tsunami isn't evil. It's just suffering. And that's essentially in concord with what I was arguing for. I'm essentially saying, well, the thing itself isn't evil. I mean, yes, it can cause evil via suffering, but at the same time, it isn't evil in itself. Now, perhaps just clarify it further. God has a will. There is no natural in your proposed framework. There's only God's will and God's product. Well, I think the only way this kind of framework works is precisely under a view, kind of a Malebranche's theology, in the sense that God is an individual causal agent, perhaps even to the extent of some sense of Augustinian theology, where God is precisely responsible. Though Augustine perhaps is less clear about the subject, but the idea that God individually causes every single causal chain instead of having a bit more of a detached God. And this is something that I was discussing with Scrungy or Danny, whatever he goes by. I forgot his name already. But essentially, my theory is essentially that God creates a world with natural laws in it, which is most productive for human life, and then after that just leaves the world to be. Although he does interact at times, and in that sense, while God does indeed have a will, he's not necessarily controlling the individual tsunami. And even in response to the individual tsunami, I think there's very good reason to suggest that the very existence of the laws which keep us alive are the same laws which cause tsunamis and earthquakes and avalanches, for example. You can't have an avalanche without gravity, but then you can't have human life without gravity as well. So there's a bit of a balance there. And I think that the same goes with most natural kind of sufferings, perhaps.
Yeah. Then I think the natural question to ask is, well, why doesn't God intervene?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the natural answer is that God does not need to intervene, in the sense that if God intervenes, it doesn't really change anything. It's not necessarily a role of God being the Deus ex machina. For example, if you look at you could look at a situation where you say, well, maybe you have how would you classify it? Perhaps you have a situation where God just solves every problems. Well, maybe that's a possible world, but I don't necessarily think that that's a world where God is in some sense more morally obliged to create such a world, because it does seem absurd, at least from my perspective, to suggest that God is necessarily there with the end to just create the best life for humans possible on this earth. That has never been the purpose of the world. And in fact, I don't think any person in antiquity ever cared about this natural evil problem until the recent times, where our kind of conception of the world has changed mainly away from this good and evil dynamic to a dynamic of what is the most comfortable way, a consumer culture perhaps in some degrees. And by changing that culture, perhaps even the philosophical discussion or debate about philosophy, or at least God's relationship to the world, and especially natural evils and suffering, that is where the change occurs. And it really depends where you're starting off your foundations from. And if your foundation is precisely the theological one, such that the ultimate good is not necessarily to make humans the most comfortable, then the entire problem about natural evil, of course, it has a great phenomenological significance, doesn't have a philosophical strength behind it as well.
So would you say that the purpose of creation is maybe the maximization of good, or the maximization of the potential for good, or is it a weighing of balance between good and evil? Because I think there's a strong intuitive sense in which natural suffering is evil, period. Although, how would you argue against this kind of argument?
Well, I think I'll argue the same way as before, that natural evil just isn't evil, because it doesn't have a moral agent, and you have to have a moral agent in order to call it to be evil. Because in order for something to be evil, you can't just say, well, yeah, I wouldn't say, like, I don't know, how would you describe it? If my aircon fell down on top of me right now and crushed me in the head, I wouldn't necessarily say that evil. I would say that's suffering because I'm going to be in pain, but I wouldn't necessarily blame the aircon for being an evil agent to kill me, right? So
Right.
I think there's a mix between the suffering and evil, as we've touched upon before, perhaps.
I guess the idea is not that. The idea is the very occurrence of suffering, when it is there to a sufficient degree, is evil intuitively. How would you respond to this? So perhaps this occurrence of evil does not need an agent. It is evil, period, when there's too much suffering. Or to take another example, the God intervening scenario. So let's say we have, maybe in a concentration camp, there's great suffering, and there is also an agent doing the suffering, or a lot of agents doing the suffering. Then in that case, if what God wants to do is to maximize good and minimize evil in the world, at least that's under the current classification, you may disagree with this idea, then why wouldn't God intervene in such a scenario? So there's, I guess, two questions. One is the intervention scenario of man-made suffering, which is intuitively evil, as well as the idea that natural suffering to a sufficient degree is evil in itself. It doesn't need an evildoer, a moral agent.
Well, I think that let's solve the second one first, because I think it's the more simple one to solve. Essentially, what's happening right now is an equivocation on the definition of good. I'm using good in different ways. You're using good and evil perhaps in the same way, in the sense that you're defining evil in a way that it's not necessarily moral evil, but rather just evil simpliciter. Whereas I'm defining evil as in moral evil. And I don't think that's necessarily significant. I think that if you want to use evil as evil simpliciter, then you have to take into consideration more problems. I just think that when we're discussing this evil, at least in the relationship of sin, which I'm trying to stay upon, I think it's important that we focus on moral evil, sin, instead of the discussion about nature. Now talking about God in the concentration camps, I think that would lead to a significantly other problem, because the world is a world in which humans have free will. And what I feel very squirmish about, or what I will not do, is to say, well, God should stop some evil situations, but not all, and there's a massive judge between the two. But rather, I think that in order for humanity to have the fullest experience in the sense of freedom in evil and in good as well, God, in his role, has to be a third person observer. Yes, he can prompt people to do good and evil, but it's not his job, and it's not us to expect him to change what people are doing individually and intervening whenever necessary. He has done so, or at least some people would say he's done so in the Old Testament to certain degrees. But at the same time, when he doesn't do it, I don't think the onus is on him to do it, but rather it is a struggle in which we all have to struggle with, fight, and try to avoid. because we can all, the World War II, the concentration camps probably could have all been avoided if Hitler had a better education, he had a better development as a child, or all the people around him had better developments as a child. People weren't so gullible. There's a lot of small things put together which build up to the entire problem that we see, and it's the failure of duty by so many different people which lead to a certain problem, and such that God, the responsibility shouldn't be laid with God, but rather on man, and man has to find his solution within the world, and that's the most important thing, I think, and that's a way in which you can move towards the good and move towards redemption.
Well, I'll pitch another idea. This is the almost Lutheran idea that in order for you to do good, in order for you to go away from sin, you necessarily need the assistance of God, and that you need almost an inner revolution of the soul, so to speak, in order for you to turn from evil towards the good. Because without this very act of turning, which is most cataclysmic and requires intervention, you, no matter how much you will, you won't be able to do that which you will. Or even if you do that which is correct, you wouldn't be willing correctly when you're doing it. And in order for you to align your will and what you're doing outside, you must need divine intervention to align yourself, because it was just so incredibly difficult for one to do anything good in the world.
I would say that God is not necessarily needed consciously for good, though he is a presupposition that people undertake. Perhaps in some sense, where in the same idea of Kant, where we all have some sense of postulation or some presupposition of the divine within us in order to understand good, whether you're religious or not, and that's on a subconscious level. And perhaps precisely in response to that is, why do you believe that's true? Surely there are those without God that lead great lives. It is definitely true that people are atheists and lead great lives. But at the same time, it's like, where do you get those standards for the good from? And I don't want to make this a full discussion on the metaphysical nature of God, because that's not necessarily what we're discussing here or trying to reach at via our discussion about the dialectics of good, especially between the relationship between sin and its possibilities of redemption, which we're trying to discuss ultimately here through our discussion of evil. Though I definitely think that there is fundamentally at least some minimal presupposition about the divine when we go around with moral decision making, no matter how much we like it or not. Just because when we step into the moral realm, the moral discussion, we are dealing with words and ideas which have been infused perhaps with religious significance, such that you cannot view them in the same way without that religious significance. For example, the idea that all men should be treated equal, it's something which, whether you argue like it or not, are fundamentally related or tied in to our religious narratives or religious ideas.
Mm-hmm. And well, it seems to me that one need not posit a God, so to speak, in order to have these ideals, at least in the traditional view of God as a metaphysical being. Rather, one only needs certain values, and I don't think God is necessary for value. And in the same way, to come back to our idea, sin does not lead to God in the Kantian way. And in the same way, okay. I think let me try this again. I think this will lead us on such too long a detour. I'd say then now we have God, and we also have the idea of redemption. Where redemption, it seems to me, has a great connotation of almost an intervention from God in order to redeem myself. Then how would you square the idea of sin to redemption towards the good, and the other postulation that God doesn't really intervene into worldly affairs in order to maximize the possibility for good?
Just a quick answer to Earth Unveiled. Yes, we are taking questions, though I'll only take the questions which I feel are directly related to our current discussion, because a lot of times in the past we've gone too much on the sidetrack, and I want to keep these a bit more kind of more precise, just for the sake of the discussion. Now, let's just talk about the idea of the redemption and intervention. I think what we're discussing about redemption and intervention, they're definitely two different things, because when we're talking about intervention in relation to the concentration camps, what we're talking about is a direct change in the actions of human beings, a direct interaction with people. I don't think redemption has the same similarity or same idea as in a direct change of people's free will. I think it is a transformation through God, which is a sense of redemption, though I would not necessarily say that it is an intervention in sense of a direct change of one's will, because it is an idea of where, and it's the simple discussion of seek and ye shall find, right? It's the idea that you have to seek and you can reach out to the redemption. You look at the sin and you can find it, it's there. But you have to first take that step. That's a different form of intervention, to find it and discover it yourself, to reach out to it, and that thing reaching out to you. Yes, you reach the same thing. That's via two different ways.
Okay, so you made the distinction between this transformation through God, and maybe another one is this intervention by God. And I just want to clarify the phenomenology of this transformation through. How exactly is this done? Because you're saying that God does not necessarily do anything. Is it more an idea of reaching out towards the good? And is this reaching out towards the good that is redemption? Then if that's the case, and how exactly do we reach out towards the good after taking the first step, as we explained earlier, of confronting the good and wanting to do good? Or wanting to escape?
Well, I want to make it very clear first that we're not necessarily tying ourselves to the Calvinist understanding that God predetermines everything, because under that understanding, then of course everything we're discussing here falls down a bit. I don't necessarily agree with Calvin, but rather what we're trying to discuss, or at least the phenomenology of it, is precisely kind of the idea of, I'm not exactly sure how to explain it, but rather it's more like, it's this idea that you are taking the first choice or the first jump, a leap. And it's the same with most things. For example, reaching out to a teacher to, like, you don't understand something, especially one of the math teachers we have. You either sit there and not know anything in front of you, and you're stupid and you're like, oh, I don't know how to do anything, I'm going to ask the teacher. Or you sit there, not understand anything, and then the teacher has to reach out to you and then ask you a question and say, do you know it? There's a bit of a difference between them. And in fact, in the second one, you really don't like it when he asks you, because it's quite embarrassing at times. But if you ask him, it might be a bit embarrassing, but at least you're the one reaching out. So you're reaching the same source, but via different means. And perhaps that is, I wouldn't say it's the best analogy. I don't think it's perfect, but perhaps some way in which you can touch it a bit better, perhaps.
Yeah, well, again, I guess my only problem with the idea that it is you reaching out is, I like the brown mug, even though none of us are applying to brown.
Indeed, I have a very funny story. I did my Columbia interview drinking from this mug.
The guy's like,
and I was like, oh my gosh! Halfway through my interview, I looked at it, I'm like, oh no, I didn't just do that. But it is what it is. It is what it is.
It's like, your interviewer probably didn't understand what brown meant anyway.
Yes.
Okay, coming back.
Yeah.
Come back. Oh, yes. I think my problem with your idea that the reaching out towards God just requires this leap is that it seems unclear to me how one, as a human being mired in sin and inability, can exactly make this leap. It does seem to me that you require God in some way changing you in order for you to make this jump. And there's also another problem is, after you made this jump, how exactly can you say that you are still yourself if after making this jump you have completely transformed yourself through God in such a way that you are not sinning so much anymore?
I think what we realize right now is precisely, or what we see is this idea that, and I think this ties back into the Dialectics of Sin of Dostoevsky, it's precisely this idea of the understanding of depravity through sin, which leads you to recognize and postulate the perfect ideal, or reach out to the perfect ideal. And that's what it means when it says, when Dostoevsky, or at least Berdyaev, discusses, like, it's precisely through the gravity of sin, the infinite, the darkness of it, which you realize the light of the ideal, and it's that darkness which leads to the light, and that the light is the only way out. And it's that first, and that's why I say the first step is a recognition of sin. You first recognize the sin, you realize how deep you are. Second, you look for a solution. You can't find another solution, at least according to Dostoevsky. And then the third one, then you reach out to God, because you realize that God is the perfect ideal. And I think that this is the same for any atheistic thinker as well. And you might say I'm insane, but I think it's quite true and quite reasonable, is that, well, just think of what is the most pure ideal in literature, even in fiction. What's the greatest story? I would find it very difficult for you to find a greater story than that of Christ. I mean, you might disagree with me, but I think that there's very little stories which show the salvational significance of the greatest being coming down to earth to die for a group of sinful beings. I don't think there's a redemptive arc which is that great. So perhaps that illustrates it a bit better for you, that it's not necessarily the idea of God intervening in the same way as God intervenes with the concentration camp, but rather that God is there, present, and you look up to that ideal that he sets. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or an atheist, there could be still a common recognition of the beauty, the purity, perhaps, of the ideal of Christ, perhaps, in some degree.
Yeah, I think that was very helpful. I think I was trying to line up what you said with the Kierkegaardian distinction between the aesthetic, the realm of the aesthetic, the realm of the ethical, and the realm of the religious. Because I think it fits quite nicely. The realm of the aesthetic is when you're just enjoying things, taken in by pleasure, taken in by what immediately pleases the senses, and in that way, it's the depravity that you're inside, and was the underground man. And then after realizing this depravity, after realizing the insufficiency of this way of life, you go up to the life of the ethical, which is the life where you know good and you try to pursue the good in order to live a fulfilling life. And I guess my problem here is that you're not really making a clear demarcation between this ethical realm and what Kierkegaard called as the religious realm, where you can only take by a leap, almost an irrational leap at that, in order for you to go up. And he illustrated the idea of the religious through the story of Abraham and Isaac. So I'm just wondering, how would you respond to this tripartite classification between the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious? And how would you demarcate the ethical and the religious? Or do you think there is a demarcation here?
Mm-hmm. So now we're moving from we're seeing the kind of the leap or the development from the aesthetic to the ethical. I think that's very helpful and precise. I think Jeremy G. Prunell does it quite well. Hedonistic lifestyles offer very little, and a comfortability is not necessarily the most good. It's something which I think allows us to at least understand the first demarcation that we are wrestling with. Though I would not necessarily say I completely agree with the latter discussion about Kierkegaard and the definition or the split between the ethical and the religious. I think how you could better understand it is it's easy to touch the ethical, and this is perhaps where I'm discussing here, and I think you touched upon a very good point. We live in an aesthetic world first to start off with. Then we realize that's insufficient. You realize the sin of that aesthetic world, and then you realize that there's a perfect ideal. Then with that perfect ideal, you reach out to that perfect ideal. Whether you're a theist or an atheist, you realize that there is indeed the ideal. You recognize in some sense the beauty of Christ, and it doesn't matter exactly how you're reaching that beauty of Christ, but rather we are indeed interacting with that beauty of Christ in different ways. And it goes back to my previous argument that you wouldn't find any archetype or story or character in fiction or history where someone is as beautiful as that of Christ. So you reach that idea and you say, well, we need to reach this certain thing. And then it is precisely that realization that Christ is the perfect ideal, which takes you the last step to the religious idea. And that is the last kind of step you take in order to you get to the end. And that's the leap, perhaps. And I'm not sure whether that's the complete picture of exactly how that works, but I think that appears, at least at face value, to be the starting point of our discussion or our inquiry.
Okay. I think that's great. The strongest objection I can think of is this Lacanian Duchekian objection. So Lacan had the tripartite distinction, which I think again maps on quite nicely to this one, where he separated the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. So the symbolic and the imaginary. The symbolic is the linguistic order, and what we have by virtue of being inside a realm of symbols. The imaginary is what we have when we, I guess, when we imagine ourselves being something, or when we're imagined by other people. So the symbolic is almost the social order that is imposed on us. The imaginary is more the images, the stories that I tell myself, and the stories other people tell me. And these two, I think, are inside the aesthetic and the what's the other one? The aesthetic and the ethical. And the problem here, I guess, is there's the Lacanian idea of the real. And for Lacan, this real is not something positive, but this real is exactly an absence, a negativity, which repels all movement. Because I guess the metaphor here is you need a certain lack in order to illuminate the presence of other things. You need a foreground, or you need a background in order to have things foregrounded. And in the same way, perhaps one would argue that this feeling of the pull towards God is exactly the feeling of the pull towards something negative. So God, in essence, this would be I think the strongest objection here. God, in essence, is not anything positive, but God is exactly a nothingness. And it is this in virtue of the nothingness of God, or its non-existence, that enables its pull towards the religious. And that's why you have this leap of faith towards the religious. Because what this leap of faith is just the leap into the negativity that we're using God to signify. I'm not sure whether that made any sense. I think that's why people call it crazy.
Let me try to wrestle with it a bit, because I wouldn't say whether I fully understand what you're saying, though I think I kind of see where you're kind of working towards to some degree. And perhaps my response, and I think my response would illustrate to you whether I understand you correctly, right or not, is precisely that I think it falls a bit too close to some sense of a Sartrean trap, perhaps, because and it feels a lot like the discussion of being in nothingness, the idea that there is indeed some nothingness in which you're moving towards or you find yourself in, and it's precisely that nothingness which represents a negative that you're talking about. I'm not necessarily sure whether that's correct, and you're talking about the religious as that nothingness, but I would say that is incorrect. I'll just reject that outright by saying, well, the nothingness it really depends, I would say, on your metaphysical assumptions, because under a theistic worldview, what you're reaching from that, perhaps as we were previously talking about the ethical world to the religious world, is precisely that leap from the understanding of the ideal, the existence of the ideal, to recognizing its actual existence. And in the same way, when you're talking about being a nothingness, that nothingness in that world is a misinterpretation of that sense. And perhaps what we're seeing, the Lacanian goes from that aesthetic world to the ethical world. And the ethical world, they do not realize the existence of the reality of the religious world. And then they fall, in some sense, they feel that they're being drawn to something, but in fact, they're falling into the metaphysics of the nothingness. Whereas the religious person, what I'm illustrating here, is that the religious world is being drawn to the reality, or the ethical world, or under the theistic landscape, is being drawn to the reality of the religious world. And as a result, while they both might think that they're having a similar feeling, they're actually moving towards two different parts. And I hope this illustrates what you were trying to say, because I don't know whether I'm illustrating that correctly.
Yeah, I think this is very illuminating. So I feel like we're working with a similar phenomenology, but we're approaching it from two sides. What I would say is that what I'm trying to gesture towards is not really a nothingness. So it's not that there's nothing up there in the religious realm, but what I want to say is the religious realm is a negativity. And the difference between this nothing and this negativity or lack is that, the very famous Duchekian example of you have the coffee without cream and the coffee without milk. It's the idea that you have the same thing, it's coffee, but it is the negative thing which you can say does not exist, but nevertheless has an influence on the real world by causing our desires and propelling our emotion. That it becomes a negativity rather than a nothingness. And perhaps the argument is that God is this negativity rather than a nothingness. And what's the evidence for this? I think one of the evidence is the Lacanian adage, love is the giving of what you don't have. And what it means by love is the giving of what you don't have is that love is the presenting of one's own lack towards an other. And this presentation of one's lack and also almost the perception of the lack inside another is what propels love. And in the same way, a Lacanian would argue, approaches God through this love by presenting its lack and having its lack almost validated by the lack on top. And it is this pure lack that one submits to, which is God, and which one jumps towards in this abyssal leap of faith. And I think it fits the phenomenology of the leap very perfectly compared to maybe the idea that God is really a thing. Rather, God is the lack which makes everything, I guess, which drives and propels all motion.
Perhaps to suggest this would be to say, in some sense, and I suppose if we maintain our yin and the yang description, to view God as that nothingness is to say that sin is as well that nothingness. For the sin would be the lack of God, perhaps, if in using your phenomenology or this syntactical structure. And in the same way, you would say, well, sin is the lack of God, and God is the lack of sin. So under that structure, you would say that to deny one would be to deny the other. And under your philosophy, perhaps, Warren G, or at least what you're trying to raise here, would be to destroy the entire concept from the first part. So as a result, what we notice, perhaps, is precisely what Dostoevsky might have been saying when he talks about the existence of freedom, evil, and sin, is to say that God is because evil is, and evil is because God is. Not necessarily because that they're necessarily tied in together, but rather it is precisely the fact that God exists which sustains the maintainment that there is a possibility for the existence of that sin. And it's precisely that possibility for the existence of sin which allows people to turn towards the possibility of the existence of God. And perhaps that is the inflex of what you're trying to say, or at least this idea in a phenomenological sense.
I think it's almost there. The one thing perhaps is the problem here is that once you go up to the religious, you cannot really distinguish sin from a religious action. Like Kierkegaard demonstrated this through the story, right? If normally you're killing your son, then it's a grave sin. But by killing Abraham, by killing Isaac under the call of God, commits a religious act and jumps to the religious. So in such a way, I think it actually fits with the idea perfectly that the religious is a lack. That you have this positive content of the act, and what happens is that you can see this positive content as both a sin or a religious act. And if this act becomes religious by virtue of not what this act is, but by the negativity which outside defines this act, and it is this that makes the religious the lack or the negative. And related to this, I think one can almost picture this using the Kantian idea that one must posit God when one is doing an ethical action, because the ethical act is impossible on earth. So you have to posit something that is perfect, that we can, and also the immortality of the soul, because we have to do the ethical act again and again to strive towards an act that is actually good. And it is the positing of a thing that we don't have right now, which is the condition of the possibility for an act right here. That is what I mean by the lack that is the religious. And then the positing of that which I have to that has to be, but it's always lacking, i.e., the Kantian idea of the immortality of the soul, or a transcendent God, the summum bonum, that makes the religious, that equates the religious and the lack. I'm not sure if that made any sense.
I think your discussion with Abraham, I was reading, because my uploads about our Genesis series is like around 30 episodes behind our creation of the Genesis series currently, even though we've already finished the creation of the Genesis series. But I was watching our episode about Abraham recently, and I was editing that one, and my theory about it is that Abraham actually had no good choice. To kill the son would have been bad, but to not kill the son, or at least go to the hill, would also have been bad as well. And in some sense, that is the absurdity of the situation of Abraham. And perhaps this idea that it is the choice of the killing of the son which saves the son in a weird sense of a twist. And I haven't thought about it completely fully, but perhaps what we're discussing here is that when you talk about the positing of God as an ethical act, Kant here gets it wrong in the sense that it is precisely the wrestling with the ethical act, or in the sense that God and ethical act should not be seen as one and the same, but rather that it is via struggling in this world that we get to know the ethical act, and sometimes we struggle with God, and it is that kind of the struggle and the wrestling with God, which allows for the good or this development from sin to be obtained. And in a same way, perhaps, it is when Abraham wrestles, brings the act of choosing to bring the son to the hill, is precisely that wrestling with God. And it's when he arrives, but it's actually precisely when he chooses, that the ram is provided and the son is saved. So in some sense, he is caught in a circle, the yin and yang that we were talking about previously, that he is indeed caught in the circle, but via choosing to save is precisely the act of being saved in some degree. And now it's not necessarily tied directly to your discussion, though it appears that we're currently just going around in circles, because I don't necessarily feel that the discussion about Kierkegaard and the nothingness is too substantive of a problem, unless I'm overlooking something, if you see what I'm saying.
Wait, I just have one last comment, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this ties everything nicely all together. Although I'm almost forgetting what I want to say. Okay, let me try to organize it. So we have the idea of potential at the start, which we defined this sin with, right? Sin is our inability to maximally actualize the potentials open to us. And then now we have the scenario of Abraham. Abraham is open, a field of potential is open up to Abraham, but it seems like there's no good choice to him. There's no potential that Abraham can actualize, which is beneficial. And here we also have the idea of metaphysical guilt, which we talked about before. Metaphysical guilt is a concept that we're born by virtue of us being human and being born, and by being open to potential. We are guilty and we are sinful. And this guiltiness, I think, is because of the scenario that you pointed to. That was the missing link to the entire discussion. The scenario you pointed to is this idea that we're open to a field of contradictions, with none of them presenting us with an optimal outcome. And it seems like every single choice that we can make is sin. And where all of these come together is with our last discussion, that God is a certain lack, or a certain negativity, a certain contradiction, a certain nothingness, which propels our emotion. And this contradiction here, this negativity in the situation of sin, is the contradiction in the field of potential, where different actions are presented to me, but the good contradicts itself, in the sense that whenever I try to do something good, there's always this evil that comes with it, which makes the good impossible. And where we go from this place of sin, this contradiction, this metaphysical guilt, to redemption, is the summoning of God as this negativity. It is the very confronting of this contradiction with with almost the intervention, I don't know, through God maybe, and participating through God as the lack, which enables us to face the contradiction directly and to perhaps not resolve it, but to make it good and be redeemed. So the redemption is the facing of the contradictions presented to us in the ethical and the calling of the negativity of God in order to transform this contradiction into a positive affirmation. Would you agree with his characterization?
Well, the only problem is, I think, is that the idea of the negativity is the main problem, because I think that if you start off with the negativity, then that already leads to the non-existence of God. And when that happens, it's precisely the moment you step into the negativity is to deny both sides of the yin and the yang, to deny both God and sin, and then you get nowhere. You don't even have the problem in the first place to even wrestle with sin. So essentially what we have to see is that to view God as negativity is to accept the nothingness, but to accept the nothingness is to deny the existence of sin in the first place. So essentially what you happen is that it seems apparently as there being a big problem, but in reality there is no big problem, precisely because the presupposition of the nothingness leads to the destruction of the ideal of sin, such that the only way to view the existence of sin is to view the positivity of God, and essentially you are once again in the cycle, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
I'm not sure whether I'm being very clear.
I think you're clear. You're clear. So your objection here is that when I provide a solution or when I provide a redemption, it is a false redemption through this negativity. Because what happens is I'm taking out sin along. I'm taking out sin along with God, or God along with sin. So although I solve the problem of sin, I'm also not redeemed through this negativity because I have nothing left at the end. Is that the objection?
Indeed, perhaps to use it in the archery terms that we have just now, it's like to say, there's a I want to try to hit the target, but I deny the existence of missing the target in such a way that there is no more target, perhaps. And that is perhaps what you're trying to say, is to say that what you're trying to say by saying God is nothing is to say that I'm trying to hit the target, even though the target is itself nothingness. So you're trying to shoot constantly, but you constantly have either nowhere to miss or nowhere to hit, because the target is actually nothingness, in your view, perhaps. And that might be the best illustration.
Okay. Well, where I would disagree with you, and where I think there's a way out, and I think there's a very good objection, is that when I say that God is a nothingness, I don't mean that God does not exist, but it exists. God exists negatively, in the sense that it is real with a capital R, although it is nothing. It is a it is a non-existent real thing. And no, this isn't crazy, I promise you. Okay. An example that I would give is the Kantian example of the immortality of the soul, or of the existence of God. It is nothing in the sense that it does not exist in the phenomenal world, but it nevertheless exists as this nothingness. As in, it is something that you cannot get rid of in order for anything to work in this world, in the realm of the ethical and the realm of the aesthetic. Maybe another thing that we can think about is this nothingness is what we love about a person. What we love about a person is not any positive attribute. Because if I can say that, let's say I love someone's long legs, or love you for your, black hair, then logically this cannot be love, because logically I can love. There's a possibility for me to love someone else, since there may be someone, even though it might not be empirically true, who has blacker hair than you or longer legs than you, or we have a more perfect body, or something like that, or a more perfect personality. And what we love about this person, a person then, cannot be any of the positive attributes, but a certain nothingness, which nevertheless provokes my desire, but I cannot find in the empirical realm. So it's something that sustains the empirical, whilst not non-existent at the same time. And I think that's what I would mean by this this existent nothingness. And in this way, I don't think that I would say that when I have this nothingness as God, or this negativity as God, it eliminates the idea of sin, but rather it's the way for one to almost resolve the contradiction of sin by you having the contradiction that Abraham is in of A and B, and two, all the choices open to me are not good. And what I do is you have this negativity as God, which changes the situation in some way to make the situation to open up a certain possibility without changing the positive content of what is there. So the only way for one to do it is not to change the positive content, but to change the negative overloading or the negative shadowing of the content. Another way that we can think about it is we have history, and history is, you can say that history is one damn thing after another. It's just a ton of empirical happenings. But here's the past. This history is also what interpretation we give to the past. And what I would perhaps say is that although one cannot change the past, one can somehow change the negativity of the past, change what the past is defined against, change how we receive the past, change how the past exists in our symbolic field in order to open up towards the future and to open up new possibilities. And the redemption is exactly this act of the opening of new possibilities amongst a contradiction through the summoning of the negativity of God. And in such a way, I don't think I am throwing away the baby with the bathwater, because it's not that God is non-existent here. It's that God is very real, but God is a real nothingness, an existent non-being.
I think at that point, you would then say, well, what on earth is the point of supposing God as that nothingness? For example, when you talk about the raising of the girl, you love the girl, but then the girl is loved not because of her actually any individual properties. You would just respond by saying, well, it doesn't change the fact that the girl does indeed exist and that you do love the girl. In the same way that when you're talking all about this nothingness, I don't necessarily see what it's there to solve, nor do I know exactly what purpose it does. For the God, indeed, as you say, is very much real. So I don't necessarily see exactly what the objection comes from, and I don't necessarily see that it actually is an objection in the first place.
Well, I would say that, and I have to go soon, so I guess it's a place where we can end. That the purpose of having this God, this negative God, is to propose a way out of the dichotomy between God as intervention and God as something that I participate through which I do a good act. Because the problem here is that the interventionist God is too active. It leaves no room for our freedom. But the participatory God does not give one an explanation of how exactly can we participate in the God process in order to take this leap of faith towards the religious. And the answer here would be that this leap towards the religious is the mechanism by which we leap towards the religious is by this God as negativity. Because only in negativity can we participate in it without it intervening into the world. That's what I mean by it's nothing, as in it does not intervene into the world, but nevertheless can impact the world. So I guess that's one side of the equation. The other side is that we would require certain negativity, which opens up a new possibility in order to be redeemed. Because what we see is that a lot of times we are open up to a field of possibilities where none of the ones that we can choose is good. In fact, they're all bad. We cannot not kill our children, but we cannot kill our children. And in the face of this contradiction, in the face of this metaphysical guilt, in the face of this, I guess, in the face of this certainty of sin, the only way for redemption is through a negative God, which does not so much intervene because it's negative, but still, nevertheless, exert an effect onto the world.
The only question then, I suppose, I have to respond to this is to say, is that not the God that we started off with in the first place? The idea that God created the world and left the world, but did intervene in some stages, not necessarily to change people's acts, but rather to provide the perfect example. Is that not where we started off in the first place?
Well, I would argue that one has to one. If one was to think about this God, then one cannot think about a God that is in any way. Or you can't even think of a God that created the world and left it. One can only think of a God that is negative, just there. I really don't know how you can picture this God, but I think it's
indeed. I think there's just some problem with your thinking. But at this point, I think that we should end this.
Problem with the God. It doesn't matter. It's fine. I think it's a good discussion.
Yes, indeed. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. Of course, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. Really helps this channel grow. We are moving towards 500 subscribers, so it'd be nice if we work towards that. Like always, stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching.